Hi everybody, it's Ajanette, and we're wrapping up the final component of learning theory, or the behaviorist perspective, and that's our cognitive social learning. So one of the biggest complaints about the behaviorist perspective is it's too basic. It's either stimulus response or it's consequences, and it's like just reactive. And a lot of people argue that they don't give enough credit to the mental processing and the individual perspective. So that's where cognitive social learning comes in, because there is that cognitive or mental evaluation that goes into that learning process. So instead of stimulus response, it's now a stimulus organism response, because perception and how you think about and process that experience mentally will influence your response. So cognitive social learning theory is also known as cognitive behavioral learning, and it incorporates the attitudes, beliefs, expectations, and our motivations and interpretations of situations, as well as our emotions, in evaluating how we're going to respond to any situation. And it's important to remember that we're social creatures, so we can learn through observing others. We're around other people, we're around other animals, and imitation is a very common way in which humans experience the world. Even from infancy, babies will imitate facial expressions, stick out their tongues, smile when a parent smiles, that kind of thing. So imitation is kind of built into us, and we even have these mirror neurons that are predisposed toward imitation, where they actually light up and activate when we are engaging in watching a behavior and then repeating that behavior. And that's what we call mirror neurons. So Wolfgang Kohler was one of the researchers that kind of pushed this perspective, and he talked about the mind as this black box. There's all this unknown that's happening, and we're not just learning through trial and error, but there's something going on in that black box. And one of the first research studies that he did was an observational study where he put these monkeys in a cage, and they were given sticks, and they had bananas placed just outside of their reach, but they could reach them with the sticks. And he found that the monkeys would kind of think about and evaluate the situation and analyze how they could use the stick as a tool to get to the bananas. And then he expanded it, and he gave them two sticks that needed to be stuck together in order to access the banana. And initially the monkeys didn't figure that out, and then later on, while they were playing with the sticks, they figured out that the sticks could latch together. And once they figured that out, it's like a light bulb went on, and they recognized that they could go and use those two joined sticks to get the banana. And so that's what he called insight learning, like that light bulb, that insight comes. And he recognized that the learning was taking place, but it was this insight that kind of joined the thoughts together in a cohesive way that allowed for productive behavior. Another researcher by the name of Tolman studied rats in mazes, and he gave some rats incentives to finish the maze and others didn't. And what he found is that obviously the rats that were given an incentive, like a piece of cheese or a treat at the end of the maze, they solved the maze faster and more efficiently than the rats that didn't. And some rats just kind of wandered aimlessly and never got to resolution. And then he would put a new rat in that had never been exposed, and then add the treat. And all of a sudden, these rats that were kind of just wandering around aimlessly, boom, they could solve the maze. And so he suggested that there's this underlying cognitive map that these rats are creating. Kind of like when you drive somewhere for the very first time, you kind of create this mental map of how to get there and how to get back. And that is what he called latent learning, or it's kind of hidden learning. You don't see it overtly, but there's still learning taking place, and you just need opportunity to put those pieces together. Our most famous kind of social cognitive learning perspective is the observational learning, and that was proposed by Albert Bandura. Social learning is based on the notion of modeling, where you watch a model engage in a behavior, and then that's kind of setting a basis or a template for your behavior, and then you imitate that behavior. And Albert Bandura felt that, modeling is a really fundamental aspect of learning, and he tested it through the Bobo doll experiment. It's one of our most famous experiments in psychology. And during this era, there was a lot of discussion about whether television violence was bad for our children and whether it caused us to be violent. And so he actually did a film of a model engaging in this Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is a plastic doll with sand on the bottom, so it's kind of like a weeble wobble. It doesn't tip over. And the model was beating up on the Bobo doll. And so he had two groups, one group that saw the model beating up on the Bobo doll, and then a control group that didn't. And then he actually put the child in a playroom with the Bobo doll and other toys. And what he found was that the children exposed to an aggressive model ended up acting aggressively with Bobo. So here's a video. I encourage you to click on the link and watch the video yourself. Gives you some really good personal insight into the Bobo doll experiment. And you get to see Albert Bandura talking and explaining. And not only did children who watched the aggressive model behave aggressively, but they escalated the aggression well beyond what they observed. We tend to imitate the behavior of models. And he talked about this notion of vicarious reinforcement, not in that video clip, but in his theory in general. And vicarious reinforcement is when I see a model reinforced. So if they get some advantage or they get ahead through their behavior and I see that reinforcement, I'm more likely to repeat that behavior. So I'm going to imitate a behavior that a model performs when I see the model reinforced. We also have vicarious punishment, where I'm not likely to repeat a behavior if I see a model get punished for that behavior. Sadly, this didn't work too well for me in my childhood because I watched my older sister make a lot of mistakes. I didn't learn from her mistakes even after watching her get punished and suffering consequences. I'm kind of hard-headed, so I needed to go out and make those same stupid mistakes myself and suffer the consequence myself. So I'm not a very good vicarious learner at all. Observational learning can be both pro-social and antisocial, in that if you're around positive role models, it's going to encourage positive, healthy behavior. And the opposite is true if you're around kind of antisocial, negative role models, then it can encourage some socially unacceptable behaviors that might lead to some challenges and struggles. In order for any observational learning to occur, it has to kind of go through 4 stages that Bandura presented. He suggested first we have to have the mental ability to attend to the matter. So we have to be able to watch the behavior and focus our attention on that behavior. Then we have to have the mental ability to retain an understanding of that behavior, so some sort of memory ability. Then we have to move into a reproductive stage where we can't imitate the behavior unless we have the physical skills or motor skills necessary to reproduce the behavior. So mental ability to attend to it, mental ability to retain it and have a memory of it, and then a physical ability to reproduce it. And then once we do reproduce that behavior, the reinforcement that we experience from our environment will either encourage us to repeat the behavior or discourage us, and the behavior's punished. And so again, it goes back to that environmental consequence. So we're exposed to models in our environment, we're exposed to consequences for that behavior, and then that will determine whether we're going to repeat a behavior or whether we're going to kind of avoid a behavior. So a couple of things that might influence learning in general is, we do have a neurological response. So there's this nature-nurture interaction, and we've seen this with rat studies as well as in doing MRIs of children, where children and rats raised in enriched environments with lots of toys and activities and social stimulation, they actually have more brain mass and brain development and brain activity than children or rats raised in kind of poor and depraved environments where they don't have access to a lot of toys or social interaction. As I mentioned earlier, we have mirror neurons. So there's these fMRIs or functional MRIs that watch us engaging in activities, and there's certain neurons that tend to light up when we are watching and observing, and then those same neurons light up when we are imitating others or when we're showing empathy with another. So we do seem to have this neurological predisposition to imitate others. Additionally, we know that learning is really adaptive, so we have reflexes and instincts that contribute to our survival. And this whole kind of notion of learning sets us up for adaptation, where like taste aversion, it's in our best interest to avoid certain foods that are poisonous or toxic to us. And so we're predisposed to develop taste aversions to those things. If we eat something that makes us sick, but we're also like around something visually or around something auditorily, we develop an aversion toward what we ate, not what we hear, what we see. So it really is showing this kind of biological preparedness for this learning process that helps us associate certain stimuli with certain responses. Again, I'm going to associate my sickness with something I've eaten, not something that is also in the environment at the time that I eat it. And also, when we're talking about being sick, that conditioned stimulus is always a food. I don't develop an aversion toward a sound or a person, but toward the food that I consumed. And then finally, there's this notion of instinctive drift, where we can train and condition behaviors all we want, but ultimately, certain animals are gonna revert back to those instinctive behaviors. I have 2 bunnies, and Peeps chews on everything, and it drives me mad. And so sometimes I'll tell her, like, why you gotta chew on that? Why do you have to chew on my bee sports? Or why do you have to chew on my comforter or whatever? And my kids say, 'cause she's a bunny. So she'll always drift back to being a bunny. I might be able to teach her to do cartwheels or flips, but she'll still always revert back to being a bunny. And bunnies chew on things. So it's just something I should expect. Either way, conditioning is a part of our everyday lives. It's very common with prejudice, classical conditioning. We have a very famous study where children showed a preference for white dolls, even black children, because they associated the black skin with the negative qualities. And we see this on media where minorities are represented in these criminal elements, and so it's very easy to develop negative feelings and perceptions of minority groups. Phobias, marketing, as I mentioned in classical conditioning section. Additionally, operant conditioning can promote prejudice and criminal behavior, because we're reinforced. Our role models might say good job or laugh or whatever, and that reinforces that negative behavior. And then finally, cognitive social learning, we observe our models, and sometimes those might be media influences. You have people doing the Kylie Jenner lip kit thing and beating up their lips so they can look like Kylie Jenner, and we see them kind of imitating those behaviors. We also see video games and a link to violence, and the more violent and aggressive games children play, the more violent and aggressive they may be as well. So research has really supported the concept of learning theory through classical, operant, and social learning. And it's a very powerful way in which our behavior is shaped, as well as our attitudes and emotions. So be mindful and know the strategies to kind of reshape your behaviors and attitudes in positive, healthy, constructive ways. Okay, so I will see you for the next chapter.